Ancient Greek Philosophers, The Secrets of History's Greatest Minds. Brought to you by Hyptoria. What if the most profound secrets of human wisdom were hidden in plain sight, waiting in the words of men who lived over 2,000 years ago? In the bustling marketplaces of ancient Athens, the academies of Alexandria, and the gardens of philosophical schools, a remarkable group of thinkers unlocked the deepest mysteries of existence, happiness, and human potential. These weren't merely scholars debating abstract ideas. They were revolutionaries who dared to question everything, rebels who chose truth over comfort, and visionaries who discovered principles of living so powerful that emperors sought their counsel, and their insights still guide the greatest minds of our time. From Socrates, who proved that wisdom begins with admitting ignorance, to Aristotle, who mapped the entire landscape of human knowledge, from Stoics, who found unshakable peace in the midst of chaos, to Epicureans who discovered the true nature of happiness. These philosophical giants left behind a treasure trove of practical wisdom for anyone bold enough to follow their lead. They faced down tyrants, endured exile, chose death over compromise, and transformed personal suffering into universal insights that have guided humanity through its darkest hours and greatest triumphs. Their methods for clear thinking, their strategies for resilient living, and their blueprints for human flourishing aren't museum pieces. They're battle-tested tools for anyone seeking to live with purpose, think with clarity, and achieve the kind of deep satisfaction that no external circumstance can destroy. This is their story, their wisdom, and their invitation to join the ranks of those who refuse to live unexamined lives. Chapter 1. The Dawn of Wonder. Why is there something rather than nothing? What if I told you that the person who invented philosophy also predicted a solar eclipse that stopped a war? The year is 585 BCE. Two armies, the Lydians and the Medes, are locked in bitter combat when suddenly the sun begins to disappear. As darkness spreads across the battlefield, warriors drop their weapons in terror. The gods are angry. The world is ending. But one man, standing in the bustling port city of Miletus, isn't surprised at all. He's been expecting this. His name is Thales, and he's about to change everything we think we know about reality. Picture ancient Miletus, a thriving crossroads where Egyptian priests debate with Babylonian astronomers, where Persian merchants argue with Greek sailors. It's a city drunk on trade, knowledge, and possibilities. And in this intellectual melting pot, something unprecedented is happening. For the first time in human history, people are beginning to explain the world without gods. Before Thales, when people asked why earthquakes shook the ground, priests would speak of angry titans trapped beneath the earth. When they wondered about the stars, they heard stories of heroes transformed into constellations. When floods destroyed their crops, it was divine punishment. The world was a mystery wrapped in mythology, explained by the whims of immortal beings who loved, hated, and schemed like humans, but with cosmic power. Thales looked at this same world and said something revolutionary. What if there's a pattern here? What if we can understand this? He wasn't the first smart person who ever lived, but he was the first to make a radical bet, that human reason could unlock the secrets of existence. When he gazed at the endless variety of things around him, water flowing, fire burning, earth solid beneath his feet, air moving through the trees, he asked a question no one had quite asked before. What if all of this is really just one thing, in different forms? His answer seems almost childish now. Everything is water. The earth floats on water. Earthquakes happen when waves rock our floating island. Even our souls are made of a kind of divine water. But don't laugh yet. Thales wasn't being naive. He was being revolutionary. Think about what he was really doing. Instead of accepting the traditional stories about Atlas holding up the world, or Poseidon shaking the seafloor in anger, Thales was proposing something breathtaking. The universe operates according to discoverable principles. Reality has an underlying unity. We can figure this out. When that solar eclipse darkened the battlefield and ended the war, it wasn't because Thales had supernatural powers. He'd been talking to Babylonian astronomers, learning their mathematical patterns, studying the cycles of celestial bodies. He glimpsed something profound. Nature follows rules, and minds can discover those rules. But Thales was just the beginning. His student Anaximander pushed even further into the unknown. Imagine being the first person to draw a map of the world. Anaximander did that. Imagine being the first to propose that humans evolved from fish. He did that too. But his most mind-bending idea was this: the source of all things isn't any particular element like water or fire. It's something he called the boundless, an infinite, indefinite substance from which all definite things emerge and to which they return. Picture young Anaximander walking with his teacher through Miletus, arguing about the nature of reality. "Master Thales, if everything is water, what was there before water? And what happens when water changes into earth or air?" Thales might have smiled. This is what he'd hoped for: students who wouldn't just accept answers, but would push deeper into the mystery. Anaximander's boundless was an incredibly sophisticated idea. He was essentially saying that reality has a source beyond anything we can directly experience, something that contains infinite possibilities. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. Anaximander didn't just think about one world. He imagined countless worlds, each one arising from the boundless, flourishing and then passing away. Infinite worlds across infinite time. 2.5 millennia before modern cosmology, a man walking the streets of an ancient Greek city was contemplating the multiverse. And then came Anaximenes, who refined their insights even further. Everything is air, he proposed. Not just physically, but conceptually. Air was the perfect metaphor for something that could become dense or rare, visible or invisible, moving or still. When air condenses, it becomes water, then earth. When it rarefies, it becomes fire. Breathe in, breathe out. The cosmos, inhaling and exhaling. Just as our soul, being air, holds us together and controls us, Anaximenes wrote, so do breath and air encompass the whole cosmos. Do you hear what's happening here? These weren't just abstract speculations. These men were grappling with the deepest questions humans can ask. Where did everything come from? What holds it all together? How does change happen? Why is there something rather than nothing? But they weren't just asking these questions. They were developing a method for answering them. Observation, reasoning, argument, evidence. They were inventing rationality itself. The earthquake that had once been Poseidon's rage became shifting pressures in the earth. The plague that had been divine punishment became a natural phenomenon with discoverable causes. The eclipse that had terrified armies became a predictable celestial event. One by one, the gods were retreating from the natural world. Not because these early philosophers were atheists, but because they discovered something even more amazing than magic. The universe makes sense. Yet here's what's most remarkable about these first philosophers. They weren't just creating science. They were creating wonder. When Thales declared that all things are full of gods, he didn't mean the world was populated by supernatural beings. He meant that existence itself is divine. The very fact that water can become clouds, that seeds can become trees, that thought can contemplate itself, this is miraculous enough. This is why Aristotle would later call Thales the first philosopher. Not because he got everything right, his everything is water theory was wrong on almost every level, but because he'd made the crucial leap from myth to logos, from stories that comfort to questions that illuminate. Standing in Miletus 26 centuries ago, watching ships bring goods and ideas from across the known world, these men had a realization that would echo through every laboratory, every university, every moment of genuine understanding that would follow. Reality has a structure. Mind and world can meet. They called this new activity philosophia, the love of wisdom. Not the possession of wisdom, but the love of it. The endless, joyful, sometimes agonizing pursuit of understanding. As we'll discover in the chapters ahead, this spark they lit in ancient Miletus would spread across the Greek world and beyond, igniting minds from Athens to Alexandria, from Rome to the edges of the known world. Each generation of philosophers would build on their insights, ask deeper questions, develop more sophisticated methods. But it all began here, with a man predicting an eclipse and 3 simple, revolutionary words. Everything is water. The dawn of wonder had begun, and once that light started shining, it would never go out. Chapter 2. The Man Who Knew He Knew Nothing. The unexamined life is not worth living. Picture the most annoying person you know. Now imagine if they were also the wisest person who ever lived. It's a bustling morning in the Athenian Agora, the great marketplace that serves as the beating heart of the world's first democracy. Merchants hawk their wares, politicians give speeches, citizens argue about everything from the price of olive oil to the latest military campaign. And there, in the middle of it all, stands a man who looks like he slept in his clothes, which he probably did. He's not particularly handsome. In fact, he's famously ugly, with a snub nose, bulging eyes, and a potbelly that speaks of too much wine and too little exercise. He's barefoot, as usual, seemingly oblivious to both the heat of summer and the cold of winter. People call him Socrates, and he's about to revolutionize human thought by doing something completely unexpected. He's going to ask questions. Not just any questions, but the kinds of questions that make people squirm, that reveal the gaps in their certainty, that turn their world upside down. Watch as he approaches a confident young politician who's just finished giving a rousing speech about justice. "Excuse me," Socrates says with that deceptively innocent smile. "That was a wonderful speech about justice. You clearly understand it well. Could you help me? I'm just a simple man, and I'm confused about something." "What exactly is justice?" The politician laughs. "Everyone knows what justice is, Socrates. It's giving people what they deserve." "Oh, of course. But I'm still confused. When you say what they deserve, do you mean we should help our friends and harm our enemies?" "Naturally." "I see. But what if our friends are actually bad people? Should we help them do bad things? And what if our enemies are good people who just disagree with us? Should we harm good people?" The politician's confidence begins to waver. "Oh, no. That doesn't sound right." "And another thing puzzles me," Socrates continues, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "You say justice is giving people what they deserve. But who decides what people deserve? And how do they decide? And what if they're wrong?" By now, a crowd has gathered. They love watching Socrates work. It's better than theater. The politician, who started the conversation certain of his wisdom, now looks like a man who's discovered he's been walking around all day with his toga on backwards. This is the Socratic method in action, the art of revealing ignorance through systematic questioning. But Socrates isn't being cruel. He's being kind in the deepest possible way. He's freeing people from the prison of false certainty. "I know that I know nothing," Socrates famously declared. This wasn't false modesty. It was the foundation of all genuine wisdom. While others claimed knowledge they didn't possess, Socrates had the courage to acknowledge his ignorance, and that acknowledgement became the beginning of real understanding. But who was this man who turned philosophy from a cosmic speculation into a deeply personal quest? Socrates was born around 470 BCE, during Athens' golden age. His father was a sculptor, his mother a midwife, and these professions would shape his philosophical method. Like his father, he would chip away at false beliefs until the true form emerged. Like his mother, he would help ideas come to birth through careful questioning. He served as a soldier in Athens' wars, showing remarkable courage and endurance. His fellow soldiers told stories of how he could stand motionless for hours, lost in thought, apparently oblivious to heat, cold, hunger, or thirst. Once, during a military campaign, he stood thinking from dawn until the next dawn, 24 hours of pure contemplation. But it was in the Agora that Socrates found his true calling. He claimed that a divine voice, his famous daimonion, guided him, not by telling him what to do, but by warning him away from what he shouldn't do. This inner voice, he said, had directed him to become philosophy's gadfly, the annoying insect that stings the lazy horse into action. Athens was that lazy horse. Despite its democratic ideals, despite its cultural achievements, despite its military power, Socrates saw a city full of people who lived unexamined lives. They followed traditions without understanding them, held beliefs without questioning them, made decisions without examining their underlying assumptions. This couldn't stand. Not if human beings were capable of something greater. So Socrates developed his method. He would approach anyone who claimed wisdom, politicians, poets, priests, craftsmen, and through careful questioning, reveal that their supposed knowledge was actually ignorance. He wasn't trying to humiliate them, though that was often the result. He was trying to liberate them. Consider his encounter with Euthyphro, a religious expert who claimed to understand piety perfectly. Socrates met him on the courthouse steps, where both men were involved in legal proceedings. "Euthyphro, my friend," Socrates began, "you're prosecuting your own father for murder, which shows you must have perfect knowledge of what the gods require. Could you teach me? What is piety?" Euthyphro, flattered by the attention, readily offered his definition. "Piety is doing what the gods love." "But," Socrates replied, "the gods often disagree among themselves. They love different things, so according to your definition, the same action could be both pious and impious." Euthyphro tried again. "Piety is what all the gods love." Fascinating. But this raises another question. Do the gods love pious actions because they are pious? Or are actions pious because the gods love them? Do you see what Socrates is doing? He's not just playing word games. He's uncovering one of the deepest problems in ethics. Is morality arbitrary, based on divine whim, or objective, existing independently of what anyone, even gods, happens to prefer? This is the power of the Socratic method. It doesn't just reveal ignorance. It opens up fundamental questions that continue to challenge us today. But Socrates wasn't content with negative results. Through his questioning, positive insights emerged. He believed that virtue was knowledge, that if people truly understood what was good, they would naturally choose it. No one does wrong willingly, he argued. They do wrong only because they're confused about what's truly in their interest. This led to one of his most radical claims. It's better to suffer injustice than to commit it. Better to be harmed than to harm others, because doing wrong damages the soul, which is more precious than the body. His young followers hung on every word. Aristocratic youth like Alcibiades and Critias found in Socrates a master who treated them not as vessels to be filled with information, but as minds to be awakened. He was the perfect teacher for a generation that had grown skeptical of traditional authorities. But this is where the story takes a darker turn. Athens was not having a good century. The long war with Sparta had ended in devastating defeat. The democracy had been briefly overthrown by a brutal oligarchy. Traditional values seemed to be crumbling. And many Athenians began to blame the intellectuals, especially Socrates, for corrupting their youth and undermining their society. The charges brought against him were serious: impiety toward the gods and corrupting the young. But the real charge was something deeper and more dangerous. Socrates made people think. Standing before a jury of 501 Athenian citizens, Socrates could have begged for mercy. Neil could have promised to stop philosophizing. He could have gone into exile. Instead, he did what he always did. He told the truth. "Men of Athens," he declared, "I honor and love you, but I shall obey God rather than you. As long as I draw breath, I shall never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy. The unexamined life is not worth living." The jury condemned him to death. Even then, he could have escaped. His friends had bribed the guards, prepared a ship, arranged safe passage to another city. But Socrates refused. He had lived his entire life arguing that we should never do wrong, even when wronged. How could he break the laws of Athens now, even unjust laws? On his final day, surrounded by grieving friends, Socrates remained true to his mission. He spent his last hours in philosophical discussion, exploring questions about the soul's immortality, about the nature of death, about the examined life he had chosen over mere survival. When the time came to drink the hemlock, he did so calmly, even cheerfully. His last words, according to Plato, were a reminder to offer a sacrifice to Asclepius, the god of healing, as if death were not a tragedy but a cure. But here's what's most remarkable about Socrates' death. It wasn't really an ending. It was a beginning. His student Plato would spend the rest of his life exploring the questions Socrates had raised. Aristotle would build on Plato's foundations. The Stoics would embrace Socratic ethics. The skeptics would adopt his intellectual humility. 2.5 millennia later, we're still using the Socratic method in classrooms, courtrooms, and therapy sessions. We're still grappling with his insights about the relationship between knowledge and virtue. We're still trying to live up to his example of intellectual courage. Why does Socrates continue to fascinate us? Because he embodied a truth that remains as radical today as it was in ancient Athens. The most important thing we can do is examine our lives. Not just accept what we're told, not just follow the crowd, not just pursue pleasure or power or popularity, but actually think deeply about how we should live. In our age of information overload, when everyone has opinions but few have examined them, when we're overwhelmed by data but starved for wisdom, Socrates' message couldn't be more relevant. The first step toward genuine knowledge is admitting our ignorance. The first step toward wisdom is acknowledging how little we really know. Socrates turned philosophy from a cosmic science into a way of life. He showed us that the most important laboratory is the human soul, and the most important experiment is the ongoing attempt to live wisely. As we'll see in the next chapter, his greatest student would take these insights and build from them nothing less than a complete vision of reality. But Plato's magnificent system of thought would always rest on the foundation Socrates had laid. The examined life is the only life worth living. The man who knew he knew nothing had taught us everything. Chapter 3. The student who surpassed his master. The cave, the shadows, and the blinding light of truth. What if everything you think is real is just shadows on a wall? Imagine you've spent your entire life chained in a cave, facing a wall, unable to turn around. Behind you, a fire burns, and between you and the fire, people carry objects that cast shadows on the wall in front of you. These shadows are all you've ever known. They are your reality. Until one day, someone breaks your chains. The first thing you notice is how much your eyes hurt when you turn toward the fire. Then you see the objects themselves, not just their shadows, but their actual forms. Finally, someone drags you outside the cave entirely, and you discover something overwhelming: the sun, real light, real objects, the whole world. But here's the question that haunts you. If you went back into the cave to tell the other prisoners what you'd discovered, would they believe you? Or would they think you'd gone mad? This is Plato's allegory of the cave, perhaps the most powerful metaphor for enlightenment ever created. And it emerged from one of history's greatest teacher-student relationships gone tragically wrong. The student was Plato, born Aristocles, into one of Athens' most distinguished families around 428 BCE. He had everything: wealth, connections, talent. He seemed destined for politics until the day he encountered a funny-looking man asking uncomfortable questions in the marketplace. That man was Socrates, and meeting him changed everything. For 8 years, young Plato followed his teacher through Athens, listening to those devastating conversations, learning to question everything he thought he knew. Plato wasn't just studying philosophy. He was watching a man live it, seeing someone who would rather die than betray his principles. When Athens executed Socrates in 399 BCE, Plato faced a choice that would echo through the ages. He could retreat into private grief, or he could ensure that his teacher's mission continued. He chose immortality, not for himself, but for the ideas that had died with Socrates in that Athenian prison. But Plato wouldn't just preserve Socrates' legacy. He would transform it into something unprecedented, a complete philosophical system that would explain not just how we should live, but the ultimate nature of reality itself. The key insight came to him gradually, as he reflected on his teacher's method. Socrates had shown that most people live in a state of ignorance, mistaking appearances for reality. But this raised a profound question. If our senses deceive us, if our opinions are unreliable, how can we ever reach genuine knowledge? Plato's answer was revolutionary. Genuine knowledge isn't about the world we experience with our senses. It's about a higher realm of eternal, perfect forms. Consider something simple: a triangle. You've seen many triangles in your life, drawn on paper, carved in stone, shaped from wood. But none of these physical triangles is perfect. Their lines aren't perfectly straight. Their angles don't add up to exactly 180 degrees. Yet somehow, you recognize them all as triangles. How is this possible? Plato's answer: because your soul remembers the perfect triangle, the form of triangle. that exists in an eternal realm beyond the physical world. Every triangle you see is just an imperfect copy of this perfect original. This isn't just true for triangles. There are forms for everything. Beauty itself, justice itself, goodness itself. The physical world is like a collection of photographs, copies of copies, shadows of the real thing. True reality exists in the realm of forms, accessible not through the senses, but through reason. This theory solved multiple problems at once. It explained how we can have knowledge despite the unreliability of sense experience. It provided an objective foundation for ethics. Actions are right or wrong based on their relationship to the form of justice, not on cultural opinion. And it offered hope for human perfectibility. If we could align ourselves with these perfect forms, we could live truly good lives. But Plato wasn't content with abstract metaphysics. He wanted to change the world, to create a society where philosophers could rule and justice could flourish. This ambition led him to write The Republic, one of the most influential and controversial books ever written. Picture the scene. Socrates, Plato's literary mouthpiece, is having dinner with friends when someone asks a simple question. What is justice? By the end of the evening, they've designed an entire ideal state. In Plato's Republic, society is divided into three classes, each corresponding to a part of the soul. The guardians, philosophy kings, represent reason and rule with wisdom. The auxiliaries, soldier-police, represent spirit and maintain order with courage. The producers, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, represent appetite and provide material goods through self-discipline. Justice happens when each class does its job and doesn't interfere with the others. It's a beautiful, harmonious vision, and completely totalitarian. Children are raised communally, their talents identified early, and their roles assigned accordingly. The guardian class shares everything: property, spouses, even children. Art and literature are strictly censored to promote proper values. Individual desires are subordinated to the needs of the state. This wasn't theoretical speculation for Plato. He believed it could actually work, and he spent years trying to implement it. 3 times he traveled to Syracuse in Sicily, attempting to educate young rulers in philosophical kingship. 3 times he failed, once even being sold into slavery before friends could buy his freedom. Why did Plato think such a radical system was necessary? Because he'd seen what happened when philosophy confronted democracy. They'd killed Socrates. In Plato's analysis, democracy inevitably degenerates into mob rule. People vote based on emotion rather than knowledge, choosing leaders who tell them what they want to hear rather than what they need to know. The result is chaos, which eventually leads to tyranny as someone promises to restore order. Only philosophers, who have glimpsed the forms and understood true reality, are qualified to rule. They don't want power. That's exactly why they should have it. But even as Plato developed these political ideas, he was creating something more lasting: the Academy. Founded around 387 BCE in a grove sacred to the hero Academus, it would become the world's first university, lasting nearly 900 years. The Academy wasn't just a school, it was a community of seekers. Over the entrance, Plato inscribed, "Let no one ignorant of mathematics enter here." Mathematics was crucial because it trained the mind to think about eternal, perfect relationships. A geometric proof was true always and everywhere, pointing toward the kind of absolute knowledge Plato sought. Students came from across the Greek world to study not just philosophy, but mathematics, astronomy, and political science. They engaged in dialogue, debate, and dialectic, the systematic method of questioning that could lead the mind from opinion to knowledge, from the shadows of the cave to the light of truth. Among those students was a young man from the small town of Stagira, who would eventually challenge everything his teacher believed. His name was Aristotle, but that's a story for our next chapter. For now, let's return to Plato's cave. The allegory works on multiple levels. On one level, it's about education, the painful process of moving from ignorance to knowledge. On another level, it's about philosophy itself, the philosopher's duty to seek truth and share it, even when doing so is difficult and thankless. But perhaps most powerfully, it's about the human condition. We all start in the cave, mistaking shadows for reality. We're all chained by our assumptions, our prejudices, our limited perspectives. The question is whether we have the courage to break free. This is why Plato's philosophy remained so compelling after more than 2 millennia. He wasn't just offering abstract theories. He was describing the deepest dynamics of human experience. The tension between appearance and reality, the difficulty of genuine learning, the responsibility that comes with knowledge. Consider how relevant the cave allegory is to our modern age. We live surrounded by images, by representations of representations. We're often given simplified versions of complex events. Entertainment provides us with escape from reality, rather than engagement with it. Data would recognize our world immediately. The question is, are we content to remain chained in the cave, watching shadows dance on the wall? Or do we have the courage to turn around, to face the fire, to walk toward the light? The choice, as Plato understood, is always ours. But it's not an easy choice. Real education is painful. It requires us to give up comfortable illusions and face uncomfortable truths. It demands that we question not just what we think we know, but who we think we are. Yet Plato believed, and his life demonstrated, that this struggle is worthwhile, because only by emerging from the cave can we discover what we're truly capable of becoming. Only by glimpsing the forms can we begin to create a world worthy of human potential. The student had indeed surpassed his master, not by rejecting Socrates' teachings, but by building upon them something magnificent and eternal. Where Socrates had shown us the importance of knowing our ignorance, Plato showed us the possibility of genuine knowledge. Where Socrates had demonstrated the examined life, Plato provided a map for the examination. But as we'll discover in our next chapter, even the most comprehensive philosophical system is just the beginning. Aristotle would take his teacher's insights and create something equally impressive, but fundamentally different. A philosophy based not on eternal forms, but on careful observation of the world as it actually exists. The shadows on the cave wall were about to give way to something even more remarkable: reality itself. Chapter 4. The Polymath Who Mapped Reality. All men by nature desire to know. Meet the man who invented science, logic, and literary criticism before breakfast. Picture this. You're 17 years old, arriving at the most prestigious school in the ancient world, Plato's Academy in Athens. You're from a small town in northern Greece that most Athenians can't even pronounce correctly. Your father was a doctor, which makes you middle class at best in this aristocratic environment. You should feel intimidated. Instead, you're excited, because you've come here with an insatiable appetite for knowledge and a mind that works differently from everyone else's. For most students at the academy, philosophy means turning away from the messy, imperfect physical world toward the pure realm of eternal forms. But you can't stop looking at the world around you. You notice how different animals move, how plants grow, how governments function. While other students debate the nature of perfect justice, you're wondering about the justice systems of actual cities. While they contemplate the form of life, you're dissecting fish to understand how life actually works. Your name is Aristotle, and you're about to revolutionize human knowledge. Born in 384 BCE in Stagira, a small town in northern Greece, Aristotle grew up in a world shaped by his father's profession. Nicomachus was court physician to the king of Macedonia, which gave young Aristotle two crucial advantages: access to the royal court, where he first met the future Alexander the Great, and early exposure to biological investigation. Ancient medicine required careful observation. Doctors couldn't rely on theoretical speculations about the ideal human body. They had to understand how actual bodies worked, what went wrong when people got sick, and what treatments actually helped. This empirical approach would become central to everything Aristotle did. When Aristotle arrived at Plato's Academy, he was entering the intellectual center of the Greek world. For 20 years, he studied there, absorbing not just Plato's teachings, but engaging with scholars from across the known world. Mathematics, astronomy, political theory, rhetoric. The Academy was humanity's first think tank, and Aristotle learned from the best minds of his generation. But from the beginning, he was asking different questions. Where Plato saw the physical world as a pale reflection of perfect forms, Aristotle saw something worth studying in its own right. Where Plato emphasized the soul's journey toward transcendent truth, Aristotle was fascinated by how things worked here and now. Where Plato was ultimately a mystic, seeking escape from the world of appearances, Aristotle was a scientist trying to understand that world more deeply. This philosophical difference would eventually separate teacher from student. When Plato died in 347 BCE, Aristotle left Athens, partly because he wasn't chosen to lead the academy, but more fundamentally, because he was ready to develop his own approach to knowledge. He traveled to Asia Minor, then to the island of Lesbos, where he began the biological investigations that would occupy him for the rest of his life. With almost superhuman energy and curiosity, he collected, dissected, and cataloged hundreds of species of animals and plants. He studied their anatomy, their behavior, their reproduction. He was doing something unprecedented, systematic, empirical research. But Aristotle's greatest opportunity came in 343 BCE, when King Philip II of Macedonia invited him to tutor his 13-year-old son, Alexander. For 3 years, the greatest philosopher of his generation worked with the young man who would become history's most successful conqueror. What did they study together? Homer's Iliad, certainly. Alexander kept a copy under his pillow for the rest of his life. Political theory, ethics, natural science. Aristotle prepared Alexander not just to rule Macedonia, but to govern a world empire. And when Alexander began his conquests, he took with him not just armies, but teams of scholars to study the plants, animals, and peoples of the lands he conquered, sending specimens and observations back to his old teacher. By 335 BCE, Aristotle was ready to return to Athens and establish his own school. The Lyceum, as it became known, was different from Plato's academy in crucial ways. Where the academy focused on mathematics and dialectic, the Lyceum emphasized empirical research and systematic classification. Students weren't just thinking about reality, they were investigating it. Aristotle would walk the covered pathways of the Lyceum, lecturing as he went. His followers became known as peripatetics, literally, those who walk around. This wasn't just a teaching method. It was a metaphor for Aristotle's approach to knowledge. Instead of sitting in contemplation like Plato's students, Aristotelians were always moving, always exploring, always discovering new territories of understanding. And what territories they mapped. Aristotle's surviving works, which represent only a fraction of what he wrote, cover an astonishing range: logic, physics, biology, psychology, ethics, poetics, rhetoric, and metaphysics. He didn't just dabble in these fields. He essentially created most of them. Take logic, for instance. Before Aristotle, people reasoned, but they had no systematic way to analyze reasoning itself. Aristotle identified the basic patterns of valid inference, codified the rules of logical argument, and created the syllogism, that elegant form of reasoning where two premises lead inevitably to a conclusion. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Simple, right? But revolutionary. For the first time, someone had created a tool for testing the validity of arguments regardless of their content. Logic became the foundation for all systematic thinking. In biology, Aristotle's achievements were even more remarkable. He dissected over 500 species, identified dolphins as mammals, not fish, described the development of chicken embryos day by day, and classified animals in ways that remained standard until the 18th century. He was the first person to study biology systematically, and his observations were so accurate that modern scientists still refer to his work. But perhaps his most influential contribution was in ethics. While Plato had sought absolute moral truths in the realm of forms, Aristotle asked a more practical question: how can actual human beings live flourishing lives? His answer was the doctrine of the golden mean. Virtue, he argued, typically lies between extremes. Courage is the mean between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity lies between stinginess and wasteful spending. Justice balances the competing claims of individuals and society. This wasn't moral relativism. Aristotle believed there were objective truths about human flourishing. but he recognized that applying these truths required wisdom, experience, and careful attention to particular circumstances. Ethics wasn't about following rigid rules, but about developing good character through practice. When Alexander died suddenly, in 323 BCE, anti-Macedonian sentiment erupted in Athens. Aristotle, as Alexander's former tutor, became a target. Charged with impiety, the same accusation that had killed Socrates, he fled Athens, reportedly saying he wouldn't let the city sin twice against philosophy. He died a year later, but his intellectual legacy was just beginning. His works would be translated into Arabic, preserved by Islamic scholars, rediscovered by medieval Christians, and integrated into the theology of Thomas Aquinas. For over 1,000 years, in both the Islamic and Christian worlds, Aristotle was simply the philosopher. Why did Aristotle's influence prove so lasting? Because he created the first comprehensive map of human knowledge. He showed how empirical observation, logical reasoning, and systematic classification could unlock the secrets of the natural world. He demonstrated that philosophy didn't have to choose between theoretical speculation and practical wisdom. It could pursue both. Most importantly, he embodied a truth that remains as relevant today as it was 2,300 years ago. All human beings, by nature, desire to know. We're not content with ignorance, superstition, or partial understanding. We want to figure things out. In our age of specialization, when knowledge is fragmented into countless academic disciplines, Aristotle reminds us that reality is ultimately one interconnected whole. The same principles that govern logical reasoning also appear in biological development. The virtues that create individual flourishing also build healthy communities. The patterns that organize the cosmos also structure human art and literature. The young man who arrived at Plato's academy with an unusual interest in the physical world had become the architect of systematic human knowledge. But as we'll discover in our next chapter, even the most comprehensive intellectual system can't solve the fundamental problem of human anxiety. For that, we need a different kind of philosophy, one focused not on mapping reality, but on achieving peace of mind. Chapter 5. Happiness is the only true wealth. Pleasure is the beginning and end of happiness. The founder of hedonism lived on bread and water and claimed to be perfectly happy. The year is 306 BCE. Athens has lost its independence, its empire, and much of its confidence. The great age of Pericles is a fading memory. Alexander the Great is dead, his empire fragmenting into warring kingdoms. Traditional religion offers little comfort to people facing political chaos, economic uncertainty, and personal anxiety. Into this world of turmoil steps a man with a radical message. You can be happy. Not someday, not in another life, not when your circumstances improve, but right now. His name is Epicurus, and he's about to create the ancient world's most misunderstood philosophy. Born on the island of Samos in 341 BCE, Epicurus grew up during the twilight of classical Greece. By the time he reached adulthood, the old certainties were crumbling. Democracy had failed. Philosophy had become increasingly abstract and irrelevant to daily life, and people were desperately seeking practical wisdom for navigating an uncertain world. Epicurus had a simple but revolutionary insight. Philosophy should be medicine for the soul. Just as doctors treat physical ailments, philosophers should cure psychological suffering. And the root of most human misery, he believed, was unnecessary anxiety about things beyond our control. Consider the 4 great fears that torment human beings. Fear of the gods, fear of death, fear that happiness is impossible, and fear that pain is unendurable. Epicurus developed what he called the 4-fold medicine to cure these anxieties. First, don't fear the gods. They exist, Epicurus taught, but they live in perfect happiness in the spaces between worlds, completely unconcerned with human affairs. They don't punish the wicked or reward the virtuous. They don't send plagues or grant victories. They're simply models of what perfect contentment looks like. This wasn't atheism. It was a theology designed to eliminate religious anxiety. Second, don't fear death. Death is nothing to us, Epicurus proclaimed in one of philosophy's most famous statements. When we are, death is not yet present, and when death is present, we are not. You can't be harmed by something you'll never experience. The anticipation of death causes suffering, but death itself cannot. Third, happiness is achievable. But, and here's where most people misunderstand Epicurus, happiness isn't about maximizing pleasure in the way we usually think of it. It's about minimizing pain and anxiety. The highest pleasure is the absence of suffering, what Epicurus called ataraxia, serene tranquility. Fourth, pain is endurable. Severe pain is brief. Chronic pain is manageable. We suffer more from our anticipation and memory of pain than from pain itself. These insights led Epicurus to create something unprecedented, a therapeutic community dedicated to the pursuit of genuine happiness. In 306 BCE, he purchased a garden on the outskirts of Athens and established what became known simply as Era, the garden. The garden was unlike any previous philosophical school. It welcomed women as equal members, revolutionary for ancient Greece. It admitted slaves, unthinkable for most Greek institutions. It focused not on abstract theoretical debates, but on practical techniques for achieving peace of mind. Members of the garden lived together, sharing meals, conversations, and mutual support. They practiced what Epicurus preached: friendship, simple pleasures, philosophical discussion, and freedom from the anxieties that plague most human lives. But here's what made Epicurus truly radical. He insisted that the highest pleasures are intellectual and emotional, not physical. Reading a good book with friends, enjoying a simple meal without worry about tomorrow, feeling gratitude for present blessings rather than anxiety about future problems. These were the activities that led to genuine happiness. Epicurus himself exemplified this philosophy. He suffered from kidney stones, a notoriously painful condition, yet maintained his equanimity through friendship and philosophical reflection. His last letter, written on the day he died, perfectly captures his approach. I write this to you on a happy day, which is also the last day of my life. The pleasure of the body, which is the root of all good, compensates for all this suffering. This is why the common picture of Epicureans as hedonistic party animals is completely wrong. Epicurus actually advocated a kind of enlightened asceticism. He distinguished between different types of desires: natural and necessary desires. Friendship, freedom from pain, basic food and shelter should be satisfied. Natural but unnecessary desires, luxury, fame, romantic love, should be approached cautiously. They often bring more trouble than joy. Vain desires, immortality, divine favor, absolute security, should be rejected entirely because they're impossible to satisfy. The result was a philosophy of elegant simplicity. Send me some preserved cheese, Epicurus wrote to a friend, so that when I like, I may have a feast. Preserved cheese was his idea of luxury, not because he couldn't afford better, but because he'd learned that simple pleasures, fully appreciated, are more reliable sources of happiness than complex ones. This approach to desire transformed everything. Instead of constantly striving for more wealth, more status, more experiences, Epicureans learned to find abundance in what they already had. Instead of worrying about things beyond their control, they focused on what they could actually influence: their own thoughts, relationships, and responses to circumstances. The garden became famous throughout the ancient world as a place where people had genuinely solved the problem of happiness. Visitors were amazed to find a community where anxiety seemed absent, where people lived without the driven ambition that characterized most of Greek society. But Epicurus wasn't naive about human nature. He understood that achieving ataraxia required constant practice and mutual support. This is why friendship was central to his philosophy. Friendship dances around the world, proclaiming to all of us that we must wake up to the recognition of happiness. True friends, Epicurus taught, provide the security that most people seek in wealth, power, or fame. When you know that people care about you for who you are rather than what you can do for them, when you have companions who will support you through difficulties and celebrate your joys, you have everything necessary for a good life. This insight remains as relevant today as it was 2,300 years ago. In our achievement-oriented culture, where success is measured by external metrics and happiness is often treated as a luxury rather than a natural right, Epicurus offers a different vision. What if the good life isn't about accomplishing great things, but about appreciating small ones? What if happiness isn't something we have to earn, but something we can choose? What if the secret to contentment isn't getting what we want, but wanting what we have? These aren't just philosophical abstractions. Modern psychology has largely validated Epicurus' insights. Research consistently shows that people who practice gratitude, cultivate close relationships, and focus on intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivations report higher levels of life satisfaction. The garden lasted for over 600 years, longer than most ancient institutions. Its influence spread throughout the Roman world, where Epicurean ideas would inspire poets like Lucretius and provide comfort to countless individuals navigating the uncertainties of life in a vast empire. Yet Epicurus' philosophy also faced serious challenges. Critics argued that his focus on individual happiness was selfish, that his withdrawal from political life was irresponsible, that his materialism was shallow. These criticisms would only intensify as a competing philosophy emerged, one that shared Epicurus' practical focus, but offered very different answers to life's fundamental questions. As we'll discover in our next chapter, while Epicurus taught that happiness comes from minimizing pain and maximizing simple pleasures, the Stoics would argue that true peace comes from accepting whatever life brings and focusing entirely on what we can control. Both philosophies promised tranquility, but they proposed radically different paths to reach it. The man who had proclaimed that pleasure is the beginning and end of happiness had created one of history's most sophisticated approaches to human flourishing. But the conversation about how to live well was just beginning. Chapter 6. Virtue is the only true strength. Endure and renounce. How did a slave, an emperor, and a shipwrecked merchant create the philosophy that built Silicon Valley? Picture three very different men, separated by centuries but united by a common insight that would change the world. The first is Epictetus, born into slavery around 50 CE in what is now Turkey. Imagine spending your youth as property, your body belonging to another person, your choices limited to obedience or punishment. Yet somehow, in the midst of this ultimate powerlessness, you discover the secret of ultimate freedom. The second is Marcus Aurelius, born to unimaginable privilege in 121 CE. You're literally the most powerful person on earth, emperor of the vast Roman Empire, commander of its legions, arbiter of life and death for millions. Yet you spend your nights writing in a private journal about the emptiness of external things and the importance of inner character. The third is Zeno of Citium, born around 334 BCE to a merchant family in Cyprus. You're traveling with a cargo of purple dye, the source of your family's wealth, when your ship wrecks off the coast of Athens. You lose everything, wash up on shore with nothing but the clothes on your back, and somehow, this disaster becomes the best thing that ever happened to you. These three men, slave, emperor, and shipwreck survivor, would create Stoicism, the most practical and enduring philosophy of personal resilience ever developed. Zeno's story begins our tale. After losing his fortune in that shipwreck, he wandered into an Athenian bookshop and heard someone reading aloud from Xenophon's accounts of Socrates. Something in the philosopher's words struck him like lightning. He asked the bookseller where he could find such a man, and was directed to Crates the Cynic, one of the philosophical provocateurs we'll encounter in our next chapter. But Zeno wasn't satisfied with the Cynic's radical rejection of social conventions. He wanted to develop a philosophy that could guide someone through the complexities of actual life, family obligations, business decisions, political responsibilities. Drawing insights from various schools, he began teaching in the painted porch, Stoa Poikile, of the Athenian Agora. His followers became known as Stoics. The core Stoic insight was deceptively simple. Some things are within our control, and some things are not. Happiness comes from focusing entirely on what we can control and accepting everything else with equanimity. What can we control? Our judgments, our choices, our responses to circumstances. What can't we control? Everything else. Other people's behavior, natural disasters, illness, death, the past, the future. This might sound obvious, but think about how much of your mental energy goes into worrying about things you can't control. The weather for your outdoor wedding, whether your boss will approve your proposal, what other people think of you. whether the stock market will go up or down, how your children will turn out, whether you'll get sick, when you'll die. The Stoics argued that all this worry is not just useless, it's actively harmful. It prevents us from focusing on what we can actually influence and robs us of the peace that comes from aligning ourselves with reality. But Stoicism wasn't passive acceptance. It was about channeling all your energy into what you can actually change while accepting what you cannot. If you're facing a difficult situation, you can't control the situation itself, but you can control how you prepare for it, how you respond to it, and what you learn from it. This philosophy found its perfect embodiment in Epictetus. Born lame, possibly from childhood injury or a congenital condition, enslaved in his youth, he had every reason to be bitter about life's unfairness. Instead, he became one of history's great teachers of human freedom. No one can hurt you without your permission. Epictetus taught, you have the power to strip everything else of its power to harm you. This wasn't denial or positive thinking. It was a radical redefinition of what it means to be harmed. Someone can imprison your body, but they can't imprison your mind unless you let them. Someone can insult you, but they can't diminish your worth unless you agree with their assessment. Someone can take your possessions, but they can't take your character unless you choose to abandon it. When Epictetus finally gained his freedom, he established a school where he taught this philosophy to eager students. His lectures, preserved by his student Arian, became some of the most influential texts in Western civilization. But Stoicism's true test came when it encountered absolute power. Marcus Aurelius inherited the Roman Empire at its height. Vast territories, enormous wealth, seemingly unlimited authority. Yet his private writings, known as the Fired Rosk, Meditations, reveal a man constantly reminding himself that external things are meaningless and that true value lies only in virtue. Remember that very little disturbs the balance of things, he wrote to himself. Everything except death is theater. Think about the psychological pressure of being emperor. Every decision affects millions of lives. Everyone wants something from you. You're surrounded by flatterers and potential assassins. You have no real friends, only people who need something from you. You can trust no one completely. Yet Marcus Aurelius used Stoic principles to maintain his sanity and moral compass. He reminded himself daily that his position was temporary, that his power was an illusion, that the only thing that truly mattered was how well he fulfilled his duty to serve others. When you wake up in the morning, he wrote, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own, not of the same blood or birth, but the same mind, and possessing a share of the divine. And so none of them can hurt me. This is Stoicism in action, not cold indifference, but warm acceptance of human nature, combined with unwavering commitment to doing what's right, regardless of how others behave. The Stoics developed practical exercises to cultivate this mindset. They practiced negative visualization, imagining losing what they valued to increase their gratitude for it. They engaged in voluntary discomfort, taking cold baths, sleeping on hard surfaces, eating simple food, to build resilience and reduce attachment to luxury. They performed the view from above, imagining themselves from the perspective of the cosmos to maintain proper perspective on their problems. These weren't just philosophical abstractions. They were psychological technologies for building mental strength, emotional stability, and moral clarity. And they worked. Stoicism became the dominant philosophy of the Roman elite for centuries. Senators used it to navigate political turbulence. Generals applied it to maintain courage in battle. Ordinary citizens found in it resources for dealing with loss, disappointment, and adversity. But Stoicism's influence extended far beyond the ancient world. The philosophy survived the fall of Rome, influenced early Christian thought, inspired Enlightenment thinkers, and found new life in modern psychology. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most effective forms of psychotherapy, is essentially applied Stoicism. The core insight that our emotional disturbance comes not from events themselves but from our judgments about events is pure Epictetus. Modern therapeutic approaches often rediscover Stoic techniques. The idea of focusing on process rather than outcomes, of controlling what you can control and accepting what you can't. of building resilience through practice. These are all Stoic insights that continue to help people today. Military leaders study Marcus Aurelius. Athletes use Stoic visualization techniques. Doctors and therapists apply Stoic principles to help patients deal with anxiety and depression. Why does Stoicism remain so relevant? Because it addresses the fundamental human challenge: how to maintain inner peace and moral integrity in a world that seems designed to disturb both. We live in an age of unprecedented complexity, but also unprecedented anxiety. We have more choices than any generation in history, but often feel overwhelmed by those choices. We have access to more information than ever before, but struggle to know what's truly important. Stoicism offers a different way of thinking about these challenges. Instead of trying to control the uncontrollable, we can focus on becoming the kind of people who handle whatever comes with grace, wisdom, and integrity. Instead of seeking happiness in external things that might be taken away, we can find it in virtues that no one can touch. The slave, the emperor, and the shipwrecked merchant discovered the same truth. True strength comes not from controlling your circumstances, but from controlling your response to them. External things, wealth, health, reputation, even life itself, are indifferent. They can be used well or badly, but they cannot, by themselves, make you happy or miserable. Only virtue can do that, and virtue is always a choice. As we'll discover in our next chapter, not all ancient philosophers took such a serious approach to life's challenges. Some believe that wisdom might be found not in stoic endurance, but in shameless laughter, not in accepting social conventions, but in rejecting them entirely, not in building character, but in stripping away everything artificial to reveal our natural selves. But the Stoics had established something crucial: philosophy as a way of life, not just a way of thinking. They showed that ancient wisdom could provide practical tools for modern challenges. They proved that the examined life could be not just worth living, but genuinely fulfilling. The conversation between these different approaches to human flourishing was about to get very interesting indeed. Chapter 7. The Laughing Philosophers. Why so serious? What can you learn from a philosopher who masturbated in public and mocked the most powerful people in Greece? Sometimes wisdom wears the mask of madness, and the deepest truths emerge from the most outrageous behavior. Picture this scene. It's a sunny afternoon in ancient Athens, and Alexander the Great, conqueror of the known world, heir to godlike power, approaches a strange man sunbathing outside the city walls. The man is filthy, nearly naked, and appears to own nothing but a rough cloak and a walking stick. "I am Alexander the Great," announces the most powerful person alive. "What can I do for you?" The dirty man looks up with amusement. "Yes, you can stand out of my sunlight." Alexander's courtiers gasp. No one speaks to the emperor this way, but Alexander surprisingly laughs. "If I were not Alexander," he declares, "I would wish to be Diogenes." Welcome to the world of the cynics, philosophy's original rebels, dropouts, and holy fools. Diogenes of Sinope, born around 412 BCE, was the most famous practitioner of a philosophy that turned conventional values upside down. While other schools taught complex theories about reality, ethics, and knowledge, the Cynics had a simpler message. Most of what we think we need for happiness is actually making us miserable. The name cynic comes from the Greek word for dog, kines, and it wasn't meant as a compliment. Critics called them dogs because they lived without shame, rejected social conventions, and seemed to have no sense of proper behavior. The Cynics embraced the insult and made it their badge of honor. "Dogs and philosophers do the greatest good and get the fewest rewards," Diogenes declared. "Dogs, after all, are naturally wise. They don't worry about status, accumulate possessions they don't need, or torture themselves with abstract anxieties. They live in the present, express their needs directly, and remain loyal to their friends." But how did this philosophy of radical simplicity begin? The story starts with Antisthenes, a student of Socrates, who took his teacher's teachings in an unexpected direction. While Plato had interpreted Socrates' message as a call to seek eternal truths beyond the physical world, Antisthenes focused on something else: Socrates' indifference to wealth, status, and conventional pleasures. Antisthenes developed this insight into a complete philosophy. Virtue, he thought, is the only true good, and virtue requires nothing external. You don't need money to be virtuous, or education, or social position, or even good health. Virtue is entirely internal, a matter of character, choice, and will. This led to a radical conclusion. Most of what people spend their lives pursuing is not just unnecessary, but actively harmful. The desire for wealth creates anxiety and competition. The pursuit of status breeds envy and resentment. The accumulation of possessions becomes a burden rather than a blessing. Better to live simply, naturally, and freely. Diogenes took these ideas to their logical extreme. He owned almost nothing, just a cloak, a walking stick, and for a while, a cup, until he saw a child drinking from his hands and threw the cup away as an unnecessary luxury. He lived wherever he could find shelter, sometimes sleeping in a large ceramic jar in the marketplace. He begged for food, not out of necessity, but as a philosophical practice, a way of demonstrating that happiness doesn't depend on material security. Most scandalously, he rejected social taboos entirely. He ate, slept, and performed bodily functions wherever he happened to be, arguing that anything natural couldn't be shameful. When people criticized him for masturbating in public, he replied, "I wish I could relieve hunger by rubbing my stomach." This wasn't mere exhibitionism. Diogenes was making a philosophical point about the artificial nature of social conventions. Why should we be ashamed of natural bodily functions? Why do we create elaborate rules about what can be done in public versus private? Who benefits from these restrictions, and what do they cost us in terms of psychological freedom? His most famous encounter wasn't with Alexander, but with Plato. The great systematic philosopher was giving a lecture defining humans as mob, featherless bipeds. Diogenes burst into the academy carrying a plucked chicken and announced, "Oh, behold, Plato's human." Plato was forced to revise his definition to featherless bipeds with broad nails. This wasn't just comic relief. Diogenes was demonstrating the poverty of abstract definitions when it comes to capturing the reality of human existence. We are indeed more than featherless bipeds, but not because we can be precisely defined. We're more because we can choose how to live. The Cynics developed this insight into a complete alternative to conventional philosophy. While other schools built elaborate theories, the Cynics practiced radical simplicity. While others sought truth through complex arguments, the Cynics sought it through direct experience. While others taught in formal institutions, the Cynics lived their philosophy in the streets. They called their approach taking the short road to virtue. Instead of spending years studying abstract principles, they argued, you could achieve wisdom immediately by stripping away everything unnecessary and living according to nature. But according to nature didn't mean becoming primitive or animalistic. It meant distinguishing between what humans naturally need and what they've been taught to want. We naturally need food, shelter, companionship, and meaningful activity. We don't naturally need luxury, status symbols, social approval, or elaborate entertainment. The Cynics claim that most human misery comes from confusing these two categories. We torture ourselves pursuing things that don't actually make us happy, while neglecting the simple pleasures that are freely available. This philosophy attracted followers throughout the ancient world. Crates of Thebes, a wealthy aristocrat, gave away his entire fortune to become a Cynic philosopher. His wife Hyptoria abandoned her comfortable life to join him, becoming one of the first recorded female philosophers. Together they lived on the streets of Athens, begging for food and teaching by example that happiness requires nothing external. But the Cynics weren't just negative critics of society. They offered a positive vision of human flourishing, based on 4 key virtues: autarkeia, self-sufficiency; parrhesia, fearless speech; askesis, disciplined practice; and ataraxia, tranquility. Self-sufficiency didn't mean isolation. It meant not depending on external things for your well-being. A self-sufficient person can enjoy wealth if it comes, but doesn't suffer if it goes. They can appreciate praise, but don't need it for self-worth. They can love others without becoming psychologically dependent on being loved in return. Fearless speech meant telling the truth regardless of consequences. The Cynics believed that most social problems stem from people's unwillingness to say what they really think. Politicians lie to gain votes. Friends lie to avoid conflict. We lie to ourselves to maintain comfortable illusions. The Cynics practiced radical honesty as a form of social therapy. Disciplined practice meant training yourself like an athlete trains for competition. Just as physical fitness requires regular exercise, psychological freedom requires constant practice. The Cynics deliberately put themselves in uncomfortable situations to build emotional resilience. Tranquility was the goal, not the passive acceptance of the Stoics, but the active joy of people who had freed themselves from unnecessary desires and artificial anxieties. This philosophy found its most sophisticated expression in Diogenes' student Crates and his followers. They developed techniques for questioning social assumptions that influenced later schools. Their emphasis on practical wisdom over theoretical knowledge anticipated modern therapeutic approaches. Their critique of materialism and status-seeking remains remarkably relevant. But the Cynics also faced serious criticism. Critics argued that their rejection of social conventions was antisocial and ultimately selfish. How can you improve the world if you withdraw from it? How can you help others if you refuse to participate in the institutions through which help is typically provided? The Cynics responded that they were helping society by modeling an alternative way of life. Just as Diogenes had stood out of Alexander's sunlight, they stood outside conventional assumptions to show that other ways of living were possible. Their influence extended far beyond philosophy. Early Christian monks adopted many Cynic practices: voluntary poverty, itinerant preaching, radical simplicity. The Cynics' emphasis on inner freedom over external circumstances influenced Stoicism, skepticism, and later philosophical movements. But perhaps their greatest contribution was methodological. They showed that philosophy didn't have to be an academic exercise. It could be a form of performance art, social criticism, and personal liberation. They proved that sometimes the best way to make a serious point is through outrageous behavior. While other philosophers debated the nature of reality in their schools, the Cynics lived their questions in the marketplace. While others developed complex theories about virtue, the Cynics simply practiced it. While others sought truth through argument, the Cynics found it through experience. Their message remains challenging. Most of what we think we need for happiness is actually preventing us from being happy. Most of our problems are self-created. Most of our anxieties are based on artificial distinctions that we've learned to take seriously. The Cynics offered a different possibility: the freedom that comes from letting go of everything unnecessary, the joy that emerges when we stop taking ourselves so seriously, the wisdom that appears when we're willing to look foolish in the eyes of the world. But not all ancient skeptics expressed their doubts through outrageous behavior. Another group of philosophers took a more subtle approach to questioning human certainty. The academic skeptics, influenced by Socrates' profession of ignorance, developed sophisticated arguments for suspending judgment on all disputed questions. Their leader, Carneades, was famous for his ability to argue any side of any issue with equal persuasiveness. When Rome sent him as an ambassador to argue for Athens' position in a territorial dispute, he gave a brilliant speech defending justice one day, and an equally brilliant speech attacking it the next. Roman senators were scandalized, but Carneades had made his point. Human reason alone cannot establish certain knowledge about moral and political questions. This wasn't nihilism, but a call for intellectual humility. If we can't be certain about fundamental questions, perhaps we should hold our beliefs more lightly, listen to opposing viewpoints more carefully, and focus on practical results rather than theoretical perfection. The Pyrrhonian skeptics, followers of Pyrrho of Eleusis, took this approach even further. They practiced apalche, the systematic suspension of judgment about all non-evident matters. Instead of seeking truth, they sought ataraxia, tranquility, through the elimination of dogmatic beliefs. Pyrrho himself became a living example of this philosophy. Stories tell of him remaining calm during storms at sea while other passengers panicked, pointing to a pig that continued eating despite the chaos, and suggesting that humans could learn from its natural tranquility. The skeptics developed elaborate techniques for opposing every argument with equally strong counterarguments, showing that human reason leads to contradictory conclusions on virtually every disputed question. This wasn't meant to discourage thinking, but to encourage intellectual modesty. Their influence on later philosophy was enormous. They kept alive the Socratic tradition of systematic questioning, influenced early Christian thinkers who were skeptical of pagan philosophy, and provided tools that would later be used by modern philosophers to question dogmatic assumptions. Together, The Cynics and Skeptics offered a powerful alternative to the systematic philosophies of Plato, Aristotle, and their followers. Instead of building elaborate theoretical structures, they asked whether such structures were necessary or helpful. Instead of claiming knowledge, they practiced forms of unknowing that led to psychological freedom. Their message remains provocative. Perhaps wisdom isn't about having the right answers, but about questioning the right questions. Perhaps freedom isn't about controlling our circumstances, but about releasing our attachment to them. Perhaps the examined life requires not just analysis, but the courage to live differently. As we'll discover in our next chapter, these various Greek philosophical traditions would eventually encounter a very different cultural context when they traveled to Rome. The practical Romans would transform Greek speculation into tools for governing an empire, creating new syntheses that would influence the world for centuries to come. But the legacy of the laughing philosophers endures. In a world that often takes itself too seriously, they remind us that sometimes the deepest wisdom emerges from the willingness to look foolish. Sometimes the most profound truth is that we don't know as much as we think we do. Sometimes the best response to life's complexities is not more analysis, but a good laugh. Chapter 8. The Schools That Conquered Rome. When student becomes teacher becomes empire. Why did Roman emperors keep Greek philosophy teachers on speed dial? The year is 155 BCE. Three elderly Greek men disembark at the port of Ostia and make their way to Rome. They're not merchants or diplomats, but something Romans find far more dangerous: philosophy. One is an academic skeptic who can argue any position convincingly. Another is a Stoic who preaches virtue as the only true good. The third is a peripatetic who follows Aristotle's teachings about the golden mean. They've come as ambassadors from Athens, seeking to reduce a hefty fine imposed on their city. But their real impact will be far more significant than any diplomatic mission. They're about to introduce Roman culture to Greek philosophy, and the collision will reshape both traditions forever. The Romans were initially suspicious of these Greek intellectuals. Here was a culture built on practical achievements, engineering marvels, military conquests, efficient administration, confronting men who spent their time debating abstract questions that seemed to have no practical relevance. Marcus Porcius Cato, the embodiment of traditional Roman values, was horrified by the philosophers' visit. When Carneades the skeptic gave speeches on consecutive days, arguing first for justice and then against it, Cato demanded that the Senate send these dangerous intellectuals home immediately. If these men stay here much longer, he warned, our young people will lose interest in laws and warfare and spend their time on useless speculations. Cato was right to be worried, but not for the reasons he thought. Philosophy was indeed about to transform Roman culture, but it wouldn't make Romans less practical. Instead, it would give them more sophisticated tools for the practical business of living and governing. The transformation began with individuals who saw past the cultural prejudices. Young Roman aristocrats, educated in Greek literature and rhetoric, recognized that philosophy offered something their traditional culture lacked: systematic approaches to the fundamental questions of human existence. How should a person live? How should a society be organized? What makes actions right or wrong? What is the relationship between individual flourishing and civic duty? These weren't abstract academic questions for Romans. They were practical problems faced by anyone with responsibilities in the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. Marcus Tullius Cicero became philosophy's most influential Roman advocate. Born in 106 BCE to a wealthy but non-aristocratic family, Cicero made his reputation as an orator and politician. But his lasting influence came from his role as philosophy's great translator, not just linguistically, but culturally. Cicero saw that Greek philosophy, properly adapted, could address distinctly Roman concerns. In his dialogue On Duties, he explored how philosophical principles could guide political action. In On the Nature of the Gods, De Natura Deorum, he examined religious questions that were crucial for a diverse empire. In Tusculan Disputations, he showed how philosophy could help individuals cope with the pressures of public life. Most importantly, Cicero demonstrated that one could be both a serious philosopher and an effective politician. Against those who saw philosophy as an escape from worldly responsibilities, he argued that philosophical wisdom was essential for public service. How could someone make good laws without understanding justice? How could someone lead others without understanding human nature? How could someone serve the state without clarity about the relationship between individual and collective good? This practical approach to philosophy found its perfect embodiment in Stoicism, which became the dominant philosophical school among the Roman elite. The Stoic emphasis on duty, self-discipline, and acceptance of circumstances matched Roman values, while providing intellectual sophistication that traditional Roman religion lacked. But Roman Stoicism evolved beyond its Greek origins. Where Greek Stoics like Epictetus focused primarily on personal tranquility, Roman Stoics like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius grappled with the ethical challenges of wealth and power. Lucius Annaeus Seneca embodied these contradictions. Born around 4 BCE into a wealthy Spanish family, he became one of Rome's most successful politicians and richest men. He served as advisor to Emperor Nero, accumulated a vast fortune through various business ventures, and wielded enormous political influence. Yet Seneca was also a serious Stoic philosopher who wrote extensively about the importance of virtue over wealth, the necessity of accepting fate, and the wisdom of preparing for loss. Critics, both ancient and modern, have accused him of hypocrisy. How could someone preach the irrelevance of material goods while accumulating them so aggressively? Seneca's answer was sophisticated. He distinguished between using wealth and being used by it. A wise person could possess external goods while maintaining internal freedom from attachment to them. The key was preferring virtue to wealth, while recognizing that wealth, properly used, could serve virtuous purposes. This approach allowed Stoicism to address the moral complexities faced by people with real responsibilities in an imperfect world. Pure philosophical idealism might work for someone who could withdraw from society. But what about the senator who had to make decisions affecting millions of lives? What about the general responsible for defending the empire's borders? What about the businessmen whose enterprises provided employment for thousands of workers? Roman Stoicism offered practical wisdom for these situations. It taught that one should fulfill one's social roles conscientiously while maintaining psychological detachment from outcomes. Do your duty as well as possible, but recognize that results depend on factors beyond your control. Pursue wealth and honor if they come naturally through virtuous action, but don't make them your ultimate goals. This philosophy proved remarkably attractive to Roman elites facing the pressures of imperial responsibilities. It provided a framework for maintaining moral integrity in morally complex situations, for finding meaning in difficult circumstances, and for accepting the inevitable losses that come with political life. The ultimate expression of Roman Stoicism came with Marcus Aurelius, who ruled the empire from 161 to 180 CE. His Meditations, written as private notes to himself during military campaigns, reveal the inner life of someone trying to live philosophically while bearing ultimate responsibility for the ancient world's most powerful state. Remember that very little disturbs the balance of things, he wrote to himself while fighting Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier. Everything except death is theater. This wasn't cynicism, but practical wisdom from someone who understood the gap between public importance and ultimate significance. Marcus Aurelius faced a challenge that would test any philosophical system. The empire was beset by plagues, barbarian invasions, and internal rebellions. His own family life was marked by tragedy. He lost most of his children to disease and had to deal with his son Commodus, who would become one of Rome's worst emperors. Traditional sources of meaning, military victory, political achievement, family legacy, all proved unreliable. Yet his philosophical practice sustained him. Daily reflection on Stoic principles, constant reminders about the impermanence of external things, regular meditation on his duties as both emperor and human being. These disciplines allowed him to function effectively despite overwhelming pressures. But Roman philosophy wasn't limited to Stoicism. Epicurean atomism and ethics in magnificent Latin verse, Lucretius addressed distinctly Roman anxieties about death, fate, and the gods. In a culture obsessed with military honor and political achievement, he offered an alternative vision of human flourishing based on simple pleasures, philosophical friendship, and acceptance of mortality. His influence extended far beyond philosophy. By presenting complex Greek theories and beautiful Latin poetry, he showed that serious ideas could reach broader audiences through artistic expression. This model would influence later Roman writers and eventually contribute to the Renaissance recovery of classical learning. Even Platonism found Roman expression, particularly in Cicero's political philosophy. Cicero adapted Plato's insights about justice and the ideal state to address practical questions about Roman government. His analysis of different forms of government, his theory of natural law, and his vision of the orator as philosopher-statesman all drew heavily on Platonic themes while addressing specifically Roman concerns. The Roman transformation of Greek philosophy had several crucial features. First, it emphasized practical application over theoretical speculation. Romans wanted philosophy that helped them live better lives and govern more effectively, not abstract systems that had little relevance to daily experience. Second, it integrated philosophical insights with traditional Roman values. Instead of rejecting ancestral customs, Roman philosophers showed how Greek wisdom could strengthen rather than undermine Roman character. Third, it addressed the moral complexities of wielding power in an imperfect world. Greek philosophy had often assumed that the wise person could withdraw from political life, but Romans needed wisdom for engagement with political responsibility. Finally, it demonstrated that philosophical education was essential for anyone with serious responsibilities. The Roman elite came to see philosophical training as part of preparation for public service, not as an alternative to it. This transformation had lasting consequences. When Christianity began to spread through the Roman Empire, it encountered not the original Greek philosophical schools, but their Roman adaptations. Early Christian thinkers like Augustine would draw heavily on these Romanized versions of ancient wisdom, creating new syntheses that would dominate Western thought for over a millennium. The Roman legal system, which forms the foundation for legal systems throughout the Western world, was deeply influenced by Stoic concepts of natural law and universal justice. Roman political theory, as expressed by writers like Cicero, provided intellectual resources for later Republican and democratic movements. Perhaps most importantly, the Romans established the idea that philosophical wisdom was not just for professional philosophers, but for anyone seeking to live thoughtfully and responsibly. They created the model of the philosopher-statesman, the reflective practitioner, the person who brings systematic thinking to practical challenges. As we'll discover in our final chapters, this Roman synthesis of Greek philosophy would face its greatest test when it encountered new religious movements that promised not just wisdom, but salvation, not just better lives, but eternal life. The conversation between ancient philosophy and emerging Christianity would create intellectual frameworks that still shape how we think about fundamental questions. But the Roman achievement stands on its own. They showed that philosophical wisdom could enhance rather than replace practical effectiveness. They proved that serious thinking about fundamental questions was not a luxury for idle intellectuals, but a necessity for anyone with serious responsibilities. They demonstrated that ancient wisdom could address contemporary challenges when thoughtfully adapted to new circumstances. The Greeks had created philosophy. The Romans made it practical. And in doing so, they ensured that philosophical thinking would become not just an academic discipline, but a permanent part of human culture. Chapter 9. The Final Flame. All things return to the One. What happens when the library burns, but the ideas escape? The year is 391 CE. Christian mobs, encouraged by the imperial government, stormed through Alexandria's streets, destroying pagan temples and burning books deemed heretical. The Great Library of Alexandria, humanity's first university and the intellectual center of the ancient world for 7 centuries, is under siege. In her private study, a woman in her 40s calmly continues her mathematical calculations, seemingly oblivious to the chaos outside. She's working on a commentary to Apollonius's treatise on conic sections, abstract mathematical relationships that won't find practical application for another 1,000 years. Her name is Hypatia, and she's about to become philosophy's final martyr. But her story is just the dramatic climax of a longer tale, the last chapter of ancient philosophy's struggle to survive in a world that no longer wanted its questions. 2 centuries earlier, something remarkable had happened in Rome. A young man named Plotinus, born in the Egyptian city of Lycopolis, around 204 CE, had arrived in the Eternal City with a radical mission: to revive authentic Platonism in an age that had forgotten what Plato really taught. The Rome that Plotinus encountered was very different from the confident imperial capital of Marcus Aurelius's time. The empire was fragmenting under barbarian invasions, economic crisis, and political chaos. Traditional Roman values were crumbling, and new religions, especially Christianity, were offering alternative visions of reality and salvation. Into this world of uncertainty, Plotinus brought a philosophy of breathtaking scope and beauty. He claimed that all of reality emanates from a single, ineffable source that he called the One, a principle so far beyond human understanding that it can't even be said to exist, since existence implies limitation. From the One flows nous, divine mind, which contains all the eternal forms that Plato had imagined. From nous flows soul, which animates and governs the physical universe, and from soul comes the material world that we experience through our senses. This wasn't just abstract cosmology. Plotinus taught that every human being participates in this cosmic hierarchy. We have material bodies, but we also have souls connected to the universal soul, and these souls contain sparks of divine mind that ultimately derive from the One itself. The goal of philosophy, therefore, isn't just to understand reality, but to return to our source. Through intellectual contemplation, ethical purification, and mystical practice, the soul can ascend through the levels of reality until it achieves kenosis, union with the One. This vision attracted followers from across the Roman Empire, who were seeking something that neither traditional philosophy nor emerging Christianity seemed to provide: a rational mysticism that preserved the dignity of human reason while acknowledging the limitations of ordinary consciousness. Plotinus established a school in Rome where students engaged in intensive study of Plato's dialogues, mathematical philosophy, and contemplative practices designed to facilitate the soul's ascent. Unlike earlier philosophical schools that focused primarily on ethical guidance for daily life, the Plotinian school was explicitly concerned with transcendence, with helping human beings realize their divine nature. But Plotinus wasn't just reviving Plato. He was creating something new: Neoplatonism, a sophisticated synthesis that incorporated insights from Aristotle, the Stoics, and even Pythagorean mysticism, while remaining fundamentally Platonic in orientation. His most brilliant student, Porphyry, systematized the master's teachings and defended them against critics. Porphyry wrote influential works on logic, ethics, and theology, but his most lasting contribution was biographical. His Life of Plotinus provides our primary source for understanding the founder of Neoplatonism. According to Porphyry, Plotinus achieved mystical union with the One on several occasions, experiencing a form of consciousness that transcended the ordinary distinction between subject and object. These weren't emotional experiences, but intensely intellectual ones, moments when thinking thought itself, when the mind became what it contemplated. Such claims might sound extravagant to modern ears, but they were taken seriously by some of the ancient world's most sophisticated thinkers. Plotinus attracted students who are accomplished mathematicians, logicians, and natural philosophers. They weren't credulous mystics, but rigorous intellectuals who found in Neoplatonism a satisfying account of the relationship between reason and transcendence. The school continued under Plotinus's successors, becoming increasingly influential throughout the late Roman Empire. Iamblichus, a Syrian philosopher, developed Plotinus's insights in a more explicitly religious direction, incorporating ritual practices and theurgy, divine work designed to facilitate the soul's ascent. But it was in Athens that Neoplatonism reached its final flowering. The academy that Plato had founded in 387 BCE was refounded as a Neoplatonic institution under Plutarch of Athens in the late 4th century. Under his successors, especially Proclus, one of antiquity's most systematic philosophers, the academy became the last bastion of traditional Greek philosophy. Proclus, who lived from 412 to 485 CE, was a philosopher of encyclopedic learning, who wrote commentaries on Plato's dialogue, treatises on mathematics and astronomy, and hymns to the gods. He represented the ancient ideal of the philosopher as someone equally at home with abstract metaphysics and practical mathematics, with logical analysis and religious devotion. But by Proclus's time, the intellectual world was changing rapidly. Christianity had become the empire's official religion, and Christian emperors were increasingly hostile to pagan philosophy. Philosophical schools were seen as centers of religious resistance, and their leaders faced growing persecution. The tension came to a head in Alexandria, the empire's second city, and its intellectual capital. Here, in the shadow of the great library, the last generation of pagan philosophers continued teaching mathematical astronomy, Platonic metaphysics, and Aristotelian logic to students from across the Mediterranean world. Hypatia, daughter of the mathematician Theon, had become the most famous member of this community. She was renowned as a teacher, a brilliant mathematician, and a Neoplatonic philosopher who combined intellectual rigor with personal integrity. But Alexandria, in the early 5th century, was a powder keg of religious tension. Christians, Jews, and pagans competed for influence, while different Christian factions fought among themselves over theological questions. Hypatia, as a prominent pagan intellectual, became a symbol of the old learning that many Christians wanted to destroy. In 415 CE, she was murdered by a Christian mob, possibly at the instigation of Bishop Cyril of Alexandria. Her death marked the effective end of serious philosophical teaching in Alexandria and symbolized the broader defeat of ancient philosophy by its Christian critics. But the story doesn't end with Hypatia's martyrdom. The last Neoplatonic schools continued operating for another century, adapting to increasingly hostile circumstances. When Emperor Justinian closed the academy in Athens in 529 CE, ending nearly 1,000 years of continuous philosophical education, the last professors didn't simply disappear. Some traveled to Persia, where they found refuge at the court of Chosroes I, a ruler interested in Greek learning. Others remained in the Christian empire but adapted their teachings to Christian audiences. Still others preserved their insights in commentaries and treatises that would be transmitted to later generations. This transmission proved crucial for the survival of ancient philosophy. While the original schools disappeared, their texts and ideas continued to influence thinkers in the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic world, and eventually medieval Europe. Islamic philosophers like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes drew heavily on Neoplatonic sources, creating sophisticated syntheses of Greek philosophy and Islamic theology. Jewish thinkers like Maimonides incorporated Aristotelian and Neoplatonic insights into their theological systems. Christian scholastics like Thomas Aquinas used Aristotelian logic and metaphysics to construct elaborate theological syntheses. But perhaps the most important legacy of late ancient philosophy was methodological. The Neoplatonists had developed sophisticated techniques for reading philosophical texts, analyzing arguments, and relating different philosophical traditions to each other. They created the model of the philosophical commentary, showing how to engage seriously with inherited wisdom while developing original insights. They also established the principle that philosophy should be comprehensive, that a complete philosophical system must address questions about reality, knowledge, ethics, politics, and the divine. This holistic approach would influence philosophical education for centuries. Most importantly, they demonstrated that philosophical thinking could survive even when its institutional supports disappeared. Ideas, properly preserved and transmitted, could outlast the societies that created them. Wisdom could travel across cultural boundaries and speak to new generations facing different challenges. The final flame of ancient philosophy was extinguished, but not before it had lit countless other fires. The questions that Thales had first asked in 6th century Miletus. What is the ultimate nature of reality? How can we achieve reliable knowledge? What constitutes human flourishing? Continued to challenge thinkers in medieval monasteries, Islamic universities, and Renaissance academies. When Hypatia made her final calculations as the Christian mob approached her home, she was participating in an intellectual tradition that stretched back nearly 1,000 years. When the last professors left the academy in Athens, they carried with them insights that would eventually help spark new philosophical movements in very different times and places. The ancient world was ending, but the life of the mind would continue. Philosophy had proven its resilience by surviving the collapse of the civilization that created it. The conversation that began with the first Greek thinkers would resume wherever human beings gathered to ask fundamental questions about existence, knowledge, and value. As we'll discover in our final chapter, this ancient wisdom would prove remarkably relevant to contemporary challenges. The same questions that occupied Socrates and Plato, Aristotle and the Stoics, continue to shape how we think about technology, politics, ethics, and personal meaning. The flame had been passed, and it would never go out. Chapter 10. The Eternal Questions. Why ancient wisdom never grows old. Ready to discover which ancient Greek philosopher's ideas are secretly running your life? 2.5 millennia after Thales first gazed at the stars and wondered about the underlying unity of reality, his questions remain as urgent as ever. The specific context has changed. We now know that water isn't the fundamental element, that the earth isn't flat, that celestial bodies follow mathematical laws rather than divine whims. But the deeper questions that drove the first philosophers continue to drive us. What is real? How can we know? How should we live? Consider the explosion of interest in artificial intelligence. As we create machines that can recognize faces, translate languages, and even engage in conversation, we're forced to confront questions that Aristotle grappled with. What is the relationship between mind and matter? Can intelligence exist without consciousness? What makes something genuinely intelligent rather than merely clever? When engineers design neural networks that learn from data, they're implementing insights that echo Aristotelian theories about how the mind forms concepts from experience. When ethicists worry about algorithmic bias, they're revisiting Platonic questions about the relationship between knowledge and justice. When futurists speculate about artificial general intelligence, they're engaging with the same mind-body problems that occupied ancient materialists and dualists. Or consider our contemporary struggles with information overload. We live in an era when anyone can publish anything, when every opinion finds an audience, when alternative facts compete with careful research. This is precisely the situation that led Socrates to develop his method of systematic questioning. How do we distinguish reliable knowledge from mere opinion? How do we evaluate competing claims when experts disagree? How do we maintain intellectual humility while still making necessary decisions? The Socratic approach, acknowledging ignorance as the beginning of wisdom, questioning assumptions, following arguments wherever they lead, remains our best defense against both dogmatism and relativism. When climate scientists engage with skeptics, when medical researchers confront misinformation, when citizens try to evaluate political claims, they're using tools that Socrates pioneered in the Athenian marketplace. The relevance of ancient ethics is even more striking. Stoic principles, about focusing on what we can control and accepting what we can't, have been validated by decades of psychological research. When athletes learn to focus on process rather than outcomes, when business leaders practice emotional regulation under pressure, when individuals work to build resilience in the face of adversity, they're drawing on insights that Epictetus developed while reflecting on his experience as a slave. Epicurean insights about the relationship between pleasure and happiness remain equally relevant. In a culture obsessed with maximizing experiences, accumulating possessions, and optimizing everything, Epicurus's distinctions between necessary and unnecessary desires offer crucial guidance. His recognition that the highest pleasures are often the simplest, friendship, meaningful conversation, freedom from anxiety, speaks directly to contemporary research on well-being and life satisfaction. But perhaps the most striking parallel between ancient and contemporary concerns involves questions about meaning and purpose. The Hellenistic philosophers faced a situation remarkably similar to ours. Traditional sources of meaning, religion, community, clear social roles, were breaking down. Individuals felt increasingly isolated and anxious, and people sought practical wisdom for navigating uncertainty. Their responses, Stoic emphasis on virtue and duty, Epicurean focus on simple pleasures and friendship, skeptical cultivation of intellectual humility, offer resources for contemporary seekers who find themselves caught between conflicting worldviews and competing values. Consider how Aristotelian virtue ethics has experienced a remarkable revival in contemporary moral philosophy. After centuries of focus on rules, deontology, and consequences, utilitarianism, philosophers have rediscovered the importance of character. Instead of asking, "What should I do?" virtue ethics asks, "What kind of person should I be?" This shift reflects a growing recognition that moral life is about more than following rules or calculating outcomes. It's about developing the kinds of habits and dispositions that lead to human flourishing. This insight proves especially valuable in professional contexts, where formal rules can't cover every situation. Medical ethics now emphasizes the cultivation of virtues like compassion, integrity, and practical wisdom, alongside knowledge of bioethical principles. Business schools teach about virtuous leadership, recognizing that technical competence without character often leads to corporate scandals and organizational dysfunction. Environmental ethics has similarly benefited from ancient insights. The Stoic understanding of humans as part of a larger cosmic order, the Platonic vision of harmony between different parts of a system, and the Aristotelian emphasis on finding the proper place for everything within a larger whole, all speak to contemporary efforts to develop sustainable relationships with the natural world. When environmental philosophers argue for the intrinsic value of nature, they're echoing Platonic insights about the reality of forms beyond immediate human utility. When conservationists emphasize the importance of understanding ecological relationships before intervening in natural systems, they're applying Aristotelian principles about the need for careful observation and systematic thinking. When climate activists argue for the moral duty to future generations, they're drawing on Stoic insights about our responsibilities as rational beings connected to the larger community of existence. Political philosophy, too, continues to grapple with questions that the ancient Greeks first formulated. Plato's Republic raises issues about justice, expertise, and the relationship between individual and collective good that remain central to contemporary debates about democracy, technocracy, and social policy. Aristotle's analysis of different forms of government and his insights about the conditions necessary for political stability continue to influence political scientists and constitutional theorists. The ancient tension between individual freedom and social responsibility, explored by philosophers from Socrates to the Stoics, appears in new forms in contemporary debates about civil liberties, public health measures, economic policy, and social justice. The Cynic critique of social conventions finds expression in various countercultural movements, while skeptical arguments about the limits of human knowledge inform contemporary discussions about expertise, authority, and democratic deliberation. Perhaps most fundamentally, the ancient philosophers established a way of approaching human problems that remains as valuable today as it was 2,500 years ago. They showed that the most important questions, what is real, how can we know, how should we live, require serious, sustained, collaborative inquiry. They demonstrated that this inquiry must be both intellectually rigorous and practically relevant, both systematic and humble about its limitations. They proved that philosophical thinking is not a luxury for idle intellectuals, but a necessity for anyone who wants to live thoughtfully. The unexamined life, as Socrates taught, is not worth living, not because examination guarantees happiness, but because without it, we remain unconscious of our assumptions, unreflective about our choices, and unaware of our possibilities. The ancient Greeks also established the principle that philosophical inquiry is fundamentally collaborative. Wisdom emerges not from isolated individual reflection, but from dialogue, debate, and the mutual testing of ideas. Even the most solitary ancient philosophers, the Stoics writing in their private journals, the skeptics practicing individual suspension of judgment, were participating in ongoing conversations with other thinkers. This collaborative dimension of philosophy remains crucial. In our age of global communication, when local decisions have worldwide consequences and complex challenges require interdisciplinary approaches, the ancient model of philosophical dialogue becomes more relevant than ever. Climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, global inequality, these challenges require the kind of thinking that the ancient philosophers pioneered: systematic analysis of fundamental concepts, careful attention to ethical implications, and willingness to question basic assumptions about what we're trying to achieve and why. They also require the intellectual virtues that ancient philosophy cultivated: curiosity about how things really work, courage to follow arguments wherever they lead, humility about the limits of current understanding, and commitment to the common good rather than mere personal advantage. The ancient Greeks didn't solve all philosophical problems. They couldn't, because new circumstances create new problems. But they established ways of thinking about problems that remain as powerful today as they were in ancient Athens. They created tools for intellectual and ethical reflection that every generation must learn to use anew. Most importantly, they demonstrated that human beings are capable of more than they usually imagine. We don't have to accept inherited assumptions uncritically. We don't have to be prisoners of our circumstances, our emotions, or our immediate desires. We don't have to choose between being practical and being thoughtful. between engaging with the world and maintaining intellectual integrity. The ancient philosophers showed that we can examine our lives, question our assumptions, and choose our values. We can develop the intellectual virtues that make genuine understanding possible, and the moral virtues that make genuine flourishing achievable. We can participate in the ongoing human conversation about how to live well in whatever circumstances we find ourselves. This is their lasting gift to us, not a set of final answers, but a way of approaching questions. Not a completed system of thought, but an ongoing practice of thinking. Not certainty about the ultimate nature of reality, but confidence that reality is worth investigating, and that the investigation itself is part of what makes human life meaningful. The conversation that began with Thales' questions about water and unity continues in every laboratory where scientists investigate the fundamental structure of matter, in every classroom where teachers help students learn to think critically, in every individual who takes time to reflect seriously about how to live. The ancient flame burns on, not because ancient answers remain adequate to contemporary questions, but because the ancient questions remain as urgent as ever. In every generation, human beings must discover anew what it means to live an examined life, to think clearly about fundamental issues, and to choose wisely among competing possibilities. The Greeks began this conversation, but they didn't end it. They couldn't, because each generation faces the questions in its own way, under its own circumstances, with its own challenges and opportunities. Their greatest achievement was not solving the problems of human existence, but showing that these problems are worth our best efforts to understand and address them. They prove that philosophical reflection, far from being an escape from practical life, is essential for living practical life well. And that, perhaps, is the most ancient and most contemporary truth of all. The questions that matter most are the ones that never stop being worth asking. And the wisdom that matters most is the wisdom that helps us keep asking them thoughtfully, courageously, and together. The dawn of wonder that began in ancient Miletus continues in every moment when a human being looks at the world with fresh eyes and asks, "But why? But how? But what if things could be different?" That wonder is our inheritance from the ancient Greeks. It's also our responsibility to the future. The conversation continues, and we're all part of it. Final thoughts. This audiobook has taken us on a journey through 25 centuries of human thought, from the first philosophers who dared to explain the world without gods, to the last ancient thinkers who preserved their insights for future generations. We've met individuals who faced execution rather than abandon their principles, who gave up vast fortunes to live according to their convictions, who found joy in poverty and wisdom in uncertainty. Their stories remind us that philosophy isn't just an academic discipline, it's a way of life. It's the ongoing human attempt to live thoughtfully, to understand deeply, and to choose wisely. The ancient Greeks began this conversation, but every generation must join it anew. The questions they asked, what is real? How can we know? How should we live? Remain as urgent today as they were in ancient Athens. Their methods of inquiry, systematic questioning, careful observation, collaborative dialogue, remain as powerful today as they were 25 centuries ago. Most importantly, their example reminds us that we don't have to accept the world as we find it. We can examine our assumptions, question our beliefs, and choose our values. We can become conscious participants in the ongoing human experiment of trying to live well. That is the gift of ancient Greek philosophy. Not final answers, but better questions. Not completed wisdom, but the tools for seeking wisdom. Not certainty, but the courage to keep in inquiry. The flame they lit still burns, and it always will, as long as human beings retain the capacity to wonder, to question, and to think.